Imagine you're 100 feet underwater and suddenly your regulator fails and you don't see your dive buddy. Panic hits. You can make a choice for an emergency ascent, or perhaps with your BCD still holding air, it might be your savior. But before you take that desperate breath, there's something you need to know. What if that breath could be your last breath? Well, the science behind it will shock you, and how widespread beliefs can be shaped by rare incidences, and how in this video we'll get to the bottom of what you need to know. Let's start with the prevailing beliefs and the results of some studies I could find, and they might disgust you or even prove fatal to some. Your BCD, or buoyancy control device, isn't just a vital piece of gear, but it could be also a breeding ground. Every dive, rinse, and storage cycle creates the perfect environment for bacteria and fungi to grow. Also, the materials in your BCD can break down, releasing chemicals over time that are not healthy to inhale. Combine that with sweat, sunscreen, and minerals from the dive sites, and you've got yourself a cocktail of potential contaminants. Studies have found bacteria like Pseudomonas aeruginosa inside your BCD, which causes severe lung infections, and fungi that can wreak havoc on your respiratory system. Most of the time, a healthy body can handle these invaders without issue. But the belief is that underwater, under pressure, and with nitrogen in your blood, your immune system might buckle under literal pressure. Breathing in contaminated air in that vulnerable state might lead to lung infections, chemical pneumonia, or even worse. Organizations like PADI explicitly warn against breathing from your BCD due to a specific dive incident and a result of studies showing the potential cocktail that can form in your BCD. Also, beyond the science, many people find the idea of breathing from a BCD downright disgusting, and no one can blame anyone for that. Fair enough. Some folks are afraid to even touch public door handles. So if the thought grosses you out, you're not alone. So how dangerous is it to breathe from your BCD, really? There's one infamous case. A 58-year-old British diver who died from a fungal infection after testing his own BCD, taking 2 breaths from it before a dive. Something that seems completely normal. This particular fungus he breathed in is something most bodies can handle, but in this rare case, it proved fatal. So far, this is the only recorded death linked to BCD air contamination explicitly. One could say there could be many additional data points of lung infections, but I couldn't find the data on this. Or at least there's no study or data to prove that. Also, an additional concern is potential long-term negative effects from breathing from your BCD that are simply not well understood. There is no further data to indicate how definite of how dangerous or deadly it is aside from the one recorded incident. Now I have to come clean here. One of the reasons I researched this topic is because I was at one point taught that in order to guarantee a negative dive entry, you suck out the air of your BCD. I'll get into that more shortly, but in a prior video on diving and current, some of my audience had indicated that sharing this information could get people killed. That's a bit concerning. I know several divers who regularly suck air out of their BCD to guarantee there's no air inside. Have I inadvertently spread something dangerous or inherently cut my lifespan? Should I be calling up all my friends, proving them that they should stop doing that thing now? And should I start preparing my tombstone now that is titled Aspergillus fumigatus? I jest, of course, but after finding the science, which is a repeatable experiment, I find it a bit lackluster. I was a bit interested in digging into this more, which inevitably led to this video. Hear me out to the end and you might be surprised. Now, we talked about some inherent risks breathing from the BCD. Next, let's explore why you'd even want to entertain that idea. So, Is there ever a time when breathing from your BCD makes sense? PADI, NAUI, and SSI all don't teach, recommend, or even advise ever breathing from the BCD. Of course, these agencies work hard to minimize liability in all cases, which is understandable. They stress the importance to all their students to never run out of air. Yet, the reality is, a lot of divers do run out of air, and tragically, some still lose their lives, much more than the lives lost to lung infections. But what's important is the agency is off the hook. They never told you that it's okay to run out of air. From my own anecdotal experience, I personally have had an emergency from an O-ring pop. I've also been around a good handful of divers that have ran out of air. Sometimes people I know, sometimes people I just met, or people I see from other groups. Anecdotally, I do believe more people run out of air than we'd like to admit in an emergency or self-inflicted accident. 99% of the time, you will have someone there to buddy breathe off of, which will save the day. But in some circumstances, what if you didn't? My stance is that out of air situations do happen and you need to be prepared for them. It should be a normal expected issue that can happen on any dive regardless of the circumstances. So be ready for out of air circumstances. They will happen. So going back to how we started this video, in my hypothetical scenario, would you prefer to do an emergency ascent or try to use your BCD for some last puffs of air? By breathing into your BCD and continuous exhaling back into it, you could be afforded about 10 to 13 breaths before the CO2 gets so great that you'll pass out. Of course, those breaths could go fast, but if you're breathing slowly, that could last quite some time. The point is to buy enough time to reach the surface and with slightly less decompression risk than an emergency ascent. Just remember, the air hose will have water in it, so don't breathe in on that first breath. You have to remove it first by forcefully blowing it into the BCD or sucking it out. It's an option to breathe some air from your BCD, with the caveats that it might be a lifesaver under such an emergency circumstance. I do hope from watching my channel and being an advocate for safety that you never hit this extreme circumstance. But if you do, it could be an option on the table. Next, let's talk about the more common use case, the one that got me some flaming in a prior video. To my knowledge, negative diving isn't taught too well in most scuba diving agencies. I remember it being mentioned in the manuals, but no direct instruction. At least I never had direct instruction. My training came from others with experience diving in current environments, and that instruction stuck with me. And I'm not the only one. Let me share some circumstances that I've been through where I thought necessary to breathe the air out of the BCD. One time in Malapascua, we were diving during rough seas on these, let's say, not super sturdy wooden boats with very high swells, causing the bow to raise and lower 10 feet or 3 meters every single swell. We would be jumping at the front of the boat because of the way the boats are daisy chained. And if you're at the surface, the current will take you immediately under the ship. Our dive master very reasonably announced that we should perform a negative entry to avoid danger from the boat crashing down on our heads, which would be an instant death, provided we were very experienced divers and our dive master was also experienced. We all felt confident and comfortable with these conditions. No problem. I know just a trick to guarantee I could get down. Aside from the nasty business we discussed earlier, the specific way I suck out air is to not breathe it in to my lungs, but to bring it into my mouth with a small puff and then push it out. Usually 2 to 3 puffs is enough to take all that air out. On a calmer dive later, my buddy decided to try a more conventional negative dive entry, squeezing air from his BCD before the dive, entering the water head down, butt up, and pulling the lower dump valve. And this is the more standard practice for this type of entry. But what's interesting is he failed to maintain the descent and popped back to the surface right before my eyes. If he had tried that on the dive prior, that would have been a real dive incident with the boat crashing on his head. So that's why my mental model is thus. If you need to guarantee a negative dive entry due to water hazards, suck the air out. Otherwise, default to the standard squeeze and dump valve maneuver. That said, it's essential to recognize that BCD breathing is not normal practice and should only be considered under extreme circumstances. Circumstances that most of us will rarely encounter, if ever. For most divers, avoiding high-risk situations altogether might be the smarter choice. So you have to choose your risk tolerance. Now, let's shift gears and talk about what you can do to combat those pesky microorganisms that might be lurking in your BCD. Taking care of your diving equipment isn't just about keeping it functional. After we've discussed these points, it very well could save your life if you have to breathe from it, which is a rare thing, but if you do, here is how you make sure it's the best condition it can be for you to breathe from. Many divers, including myself, often underestimate how critical proper BCD care is. The most common mistake, thinking a quick rinse after a dive is enough. Spoiler, it is not. That barely touches the bacteria, fungi, and other tiny invaders lurking inside and can make it an excellent breeding ground. Here's a detailed cleaning routine that will help ensure those microorganisms are not having a giant party in your air sacs. First, rinse the BCD well with fresh water, especially the inflator, by pushing the hose straight into a dump valve. Second, fill the bladder with fresh or soapy water, shaking it around, then drain. Do this a few times. Third, then fill it once more using a special disinfectant like benzalkonium chloride or stearamine that kill off bacteria and fungi with water in the last flush. At least something that's going to kill the bacteria that isn't dangerous for you or your BCD. Fourth, blow up your BCD and let it dry completely out of the sunlight. Fifth, store it somewhere cool and dry. Do this deep clean at least once a season, or more if you dive a lot. Check your gear regularly for any signs of wear and tear. Catch potential problems early. It should be fine to just rinse it with fresh water otherwise. We've examined the risks of breathing from your BCD and the extremely rare but real consequences that can follow. So, what's the verdict? Should you never breathe from your BCD, even in extreme circumstances? Here are my takeaways. Avoid breathing from your BCD in normal circumstances. Normal, especially for routine negative dive entries when there are no immediate surface dangers. Use the standard negative dive entry that I discussed earlier in the video. It won't require you to suck air out, and instead you'll be squeezing the air out. And anything that doesn't come out, you use your lower dump valve after hitting the water. If you are under extreme circumstance and you do decide to breathe from the BCD, try to avoid inhaling deeply. Do a shallow in, puff out style breath. Instead, just create a little bit of a vacuum, then exhale immediately. This minimizes air intake. An underwater emergency would present a different challenge. If you're out of air at depth, you'll face a tough choice. Perform an immediate emergency ascent or try to utilize the air in your BCD before ascending. That air in your BCD can help mitigate decompression sickness while still getting you to the surface. But there can be a small risk of lung infection. While emergency ascent will likely have a higher probability of decompression sickness, which could lead to all sorts of damage as well. So, in either circumstances, the results are not great. The standard advice remains: avoid running out of air. That's always the best preventative measure, but accidents happen, gear fails, and knowing your options in an emergency could make all the difference. And let me be clear, this is not advice to start breathing from your BCD. I don't want to see anyone huffing and puffing their BCD all the time, and also revving those fingers to destroy me in the comments. I want to remind you that I've wanted to take a step back and analyze the situation deeper, to see the truths that could be found and present them here holistically. My goal here was to share the contradictions I've heard from so many divers and with you about my findings. I always find it fascinating that some beliefs that are at the core of some people and believe it to be true are not necessarily backed by scientific evidence or hardcore data. While there are studies in this case to show that there can be bad stuff in your BCD, a lot of people do inhale it, and your body is normally capable of fighting it off. But with that said, there is risk. Let me know your thoughts, and if you found this topic interesting, give the video a like if you'd like to see more of such topics in the future. It will tell me to make more like this or not. If you'd love to check the video that inspired this research, click here. And until next time.